My earliest and fondest memories involve books. Long before the 24-hour news cycle or Instagram came around, the full and undivided attention of an adult was a very precious and treasured thing. For me, that came from my grandmother in the form of storytelling and reading from books. She would read from her collection of favorite classics. Mema and some help from Sesame Street had me reading by the age of 3 in search of worlds and ideas to which books connect us. It wasn't until much later in life that I discovered the magic of a bookstore. For me, that was Chapter 2 on East Bay Street. I thought it was the most perfect place in the world, with books 2 stories high in that mezzanine. On my first date with Julian, he asked me what seemed a very strange question. What is your work dream? Work? Dream? Those don't go together, I told him. But it was a magical date, and as we talked into the night, we found ourselves sharing a passion for storytelling and the power of words. We reminisced about that then closed Chapter 2, and I found myself sharing with him a dream that I'd never allowed myself to articulate, much less share with anyone. Although we both fully agreed that it made no financial sense whatsoever, he didn't laugh and he didn't forget that I wanted to have a bookstore in Charleston. I've got to go faster because we're moving. Flash forward 2 years, we were married, and Julian called me from the corner of Concord and Cumberland. I'm standing in your bookstore, he said. And very, very long story short, because I'm not keeping up with my slides, we started that bookstore, and it turned out that Charleston wanted us as much as we wanted to be there. Several years later, we were invited to our current space at 160 King Street, and on the campus at the Charleston Library Society, and we made the decision to be a full-service bookstore selling only new books with a strong focus on author events. We chose this path so we would be a part of the ecosystem of publishing. What is the ecosystem of publishing, you might ask? I didn't know before we began using that term in the bookstore. And you may not know, even though you are the very lifeblood of that ecosystem. When you buy a new book, especially from a living author, booksellers report those numbers. That's how the New York Times, USA Today, that's how they publish those lists, and it's how publishers, whether independent or in New York, decide what to publish. You are powerful. Your purchases make a difference. I'm a collector of old and rare books, and I love a bargain, but I'm asking you to put the value back in the book and back in the bookseller. It's worth more than the paper that it's printed on. So why did we decide to focus on author events? Well, that's truly where the connections happen, with cocktail bandits and just extraordinary authors, whether it's John Grisham at the Dock Street Theater or Phil Rosenthal here. But it's also Gabor Mate at the Gilliard. Look at that team. It's amazing. But it's also local poet Jamie, and it's Miss Emily Meggett, who left us recently this year, last week. I don't know if you saw her earlier, but she is our heart, and she was just an extraordinary cookbook author and storyteller. She actually reminded me a lot of my grandmother. She was beautiful. And those connections, when we get to have those kind of connections inside of a bookstore, it's what makes everything worthwhile. We're not just selling books, we are curating the community. We are giving voice and making visible stories and people who were previously unheard, stories that were untold. And it's just a very powerful thing that independent bookstores do. We're not the only game in town. We're lucky enough to have 2 independent bookstores on the peninsula of Charleston, and I encourage you to support whatever independent bookstores you can. When you do so, when you buy a new book from a living author, especially from an independent bookstore, you're not just supporting the ecosystem of publishing, you're also curating your community. It happens on evenings like tonight when you show up at PechaKucha. It happens in the conversations between 2 people or 200 people, or in the lobby here at the music hall. We have books for every topic. The topics that were spoken by other presenters tonight, from trans rights to climate change, to race, to fashion, to humor, to healing. There are books for that. We even have books for people who don't read. We've got them. Mary Edna has a book too. And I encourage you to buy those books. I encourage you to continue to curate your community, to feed that ecosystem of publishing one book at a time, one event at a time, one conversation at a time. You're powerful, and we thank you for sharing that power, sharing that magic with the community. And there's Damon. I was going to skip this part, but it's about banned books. Read banned books. Tonight, across the river, not far from where my grandmother read to me as a child, they're having an event that's against banned books. Words are powerful. Sometimes they use words like liberty and freedom when it's exactly what they're trying to take away. So books are powerful. Conversation is powerful. Use your voice. Use your wallet. Speak out. Come to these events. These are some of our partners. These are some of the connections that we have in Charleston. We're just so privileged. Oh, and that's Dooley. You can't, he's kind of cat-like, but so he's kind of our bookstore cat, but he's very cool, he's very sweet, and he's often in the bookstore. Thank you for being you. Thank you for being the magic. Thank you to all of the presenters. I'm humbled to be on stage, to have followed you. Your stories and message is so important, and I believe that's why we have a bookstore, is because of you. So thank you, and good night.